Joining us right here in the studio is Norman Roule, who up until last year served as National Intelligence Manager for Iran at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and spent decades as a veteran CIA official specializing in Iran and the Middle East. Norm, great to have you here.
My pleasure.
Not to see you through a screen in Washington. So I want to talk to you first about what we just heard. This alleged transfer of weapons in civilian airliners, Iran sending it off to its offshoots. You dealt with Iran close up for all these decades. Give us some insight into how Iran's network actually spreads itself, how those weapons get from one country to another.
The primary means by which Iran expands its networks through the region relies entirely upon logistics profiles. They need these airlines to deliver people, money, equipment, and weapons. Because of the international community's unwillingness to take serious action against Iran's civilian and military air activities, Iran has been able to build this web of surrogates through the region. What Iran is doing with these aircraft, and its unusual movement in the last week, is probably to deliver equipment or personnel into Lebanon. I would note something else about the airline involved. It has only 2 aircraft, sometimes only 1. An airline of that size exists only because it has no exposure to the international community, cannot be sanctioned, and has a very specific purpose. I believe 3 members of its board are Revolutionary Guard officers, which should tell you a lot about its purpose.
The perfect loophole.
The perfect loophole.
Speaking of Iran moving its weapons outside the country, there was a disturbing report, especially certainly for officials here in Israel, of Iran perhaps moving ballistic missiles, shorter or medium range, into Iraq, to its proxies in Iraq that could hit Israel, could also possibly hit Saudi Arabia. It's a very complicated situation for Israel, which of course can't operate in Iraq the way it does in Syria. How concerned should both those countries and the West and the U.S. be about that development?
They should be very concerned. But I would also add that Kuwait and Saudi Arabia should also be concerned. What Iran does with its weapons is it provides advanced ballistic missile technology to its surrogates as part of an evolution of its surrogates and militias throughout the region. This is no surprise, just as they have provided this sort of weaponry to the Houthis in Yemen or to Lebanese Hezbollah. Once they believe a militia is capable of using such weaponry, they provide this as a capability, knowing that the West and regional countries are unwilling to take action against them.
Norm, on that front, we talk so much about sanctions as back and forth after Trump withdrew from the nuclear deal. The Trump administration keeps saying it has the highest pressure ever on Iran. Are sanctions capable of stopping things like that? Because Iran has been doing this for decades, even under sanctions.
Unfortunately, not in the short term. And the most significant sanctions against Iran will not begin until early November. And what is most likely is that it will take some time before the ultimate impact of those sanctions, combined with the other problems Iran is having, which is a unique coincidence of ecological, domestic, demographic, and political crises all at once before this reaches the boiling point where Iran's leadership will decide they must curtail their activity in order to relieve the economic pressure. So I am not sanguine that we will see any change in Iran's behavior in the near term.
Speaking of U.S. policy that's related to Iran and also to Syria, President Trump, I want to just read out a tweet that he, of course, sent late yesterday. He said, President Bashar al-Assad of Syria must not recklessly attack Idlib province. The Russians and Iranians would be making a grave humanitarian mistake to take part in this potential human tragedy. Hundreds of thousands of people could be killed. Don't let that happen. I want to ask what you make of that tweet. Is the president setting a red line here, as he did with the use of chemical weapons? What is the nature of the warning here?
It's unlikely the president to set a red line, in my opinion. Were he to do so, it would be something starker. And usually the United States has only done that with chemical weapons and the use of these weapons by the Assad regime. However, because Iran is involved in the upcoming campaign, it is almost certain that this will be bloody and violent with significant civilian casualties. The history of Iran's involvement in Syria has been consistently that its militias have engaged in some of the heaviest and most indiscriminate civilian fighting. What Iran does in the conflict is they say during any ceasefire, we will stand down against everyone except a terrorist. But guess what? Everyone in front of us is a terrorist. Therefore, we will continue fighting.
What we keep hearing from Russia all week, saying that we are going to liquidate the terrorists. They called it an abscess, specifically about Idlib province. But Norm, is there any significance to a red line if the U.S. does set one? Isn't the cat out of the bag at this point, 7 years into the war? Is there anything the U.S. can do there?
It's difficult on Idlib, but on chemical weapons, I think the United States made an important statement to the Iranians with the execution of a military operation some months back. It's important to note that when that operation occurred, Russia was silent, Iran was silent, Syria was silent. That operation showed the weakness of Russia and Iran in Syria, as well as American military capacity when America wishes to use it.
All right. Well, we're looking ahead now. That offensive in Idlib, as we've been reporting, expected really could be imminent, and that does seem to be the line the U.S. is talking about. U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley retweeting President Donald Trump and saying hashtag no chemical weapons. So I suppose that is this administration's red line, but certainly much more damage could be done.